The grandeur of my funeral was of the highest order. After all, I was Cashin's lawful wife, having governed the royal household as the crown princess for 4 flawless years. Even when he later lavished his favor upon Vivian, causing a rift with the queen mother, it was I who mediated and smoothed over the hostilities. When Vivian fell ill, he refused to leave her bedchamber for 3 days, scarcely eating or sleeping. When my turn came to die, his countenance bore no trace of grief. He merely sat for a long while, grasping my hand as it gradually grew cold. Should there be a next life, I shall grant you the seat of princess once more, he had promised. Indeed, I awoke to find that next life. In this time, Cashin had not yet met the supposed great love of his life, and had submitted to the Queen Mother's decree to select a virtuous highborn daughter as his bride. The Queen Mother pointed her finger at me. As his gaze swept toward me, her fingertip shifted an inch, gliding softly toward the following name upon the parchment. "Let us choose Lady Marguerite instead," she declared. The moment my eyes met Cashin's, I hastily averted my gaze. Seated upon the dais was Prince Cashin Lancaster, a youth of merely 18 summers. Clad in opulent attire and possessing a handsome visage, his expression remained aloof and indifferent, as though the proceedings had naught to do with him. He had come of age for betrothal. Having no lady to hold his heart, he left the arrangement entirely to the Queen Mother's discretion. In this renewed life, Her Majesty had also inquired of my desires. I declined with utmost tact. Thus, with a sigh tinged with regret and a brief pause, her fingers shifted to the next name, Marguerite Vane. "Let us choose Lady Marguerite instead." Marguerite rose with evident joy, sinking into a graceful curtsy to express her gratitude. Cashin lifted his eyelids, his cold, tepid gaze resting upon her for but a fleeting moment. It was the exact look he used to give me, devoid of admiration, yet lacking any displeasure. It was merely a look of passable acceptance as he conceded to the decision. The Queen Mother asked out of formality, "Does your Highness have any objections?" He paused briefly before replying, "None." If it was not a woman he cherished, any woman would suffice. Stepping out of the grand hall, a fine, ceaseless rain was falling. The puddles gathering upon the cobblestones reflected a hazy silhouette. Tilting the brim of my parasol slightly upward, I locked eyes with my 15-year-old reflection in the water, as if my past life and present existence had suddenly overlapped. Since Cashin had consented to the match, there would be no altering it. I would never again perish from illness within the suffocating walls of the royal palace. I remembered the day of my death with excruciating clarity. Courtiers and attendants came in endless waves. Ministers stood outside the chamber with heads bowed in solemn reverence, while noble ladies knelt within, keeping their gazes lowered. Only Vivian did not attend. She claimed her constitution was too frail and feared catching the miasma of my illness. Cashin sat at my bedside, clasping my cooling hand, the silken cuffs of his doublet draped over the back of my hand, soft against my skin. My eyelids fluttered shut, but I forced myself to recall the final matters I needed to entrust to him. "If you must crown a new queen, I beg you to choose Lady Marguerite," I whispered. "She is composed and dignified. She will certainly not make life difficult for Vivian." Truthfully, I harbored my own selfish motives. Firstly, though Marguerite and I had contended against one another for years, I admired her. Her lifelong ambition was simply to stand above the multitudes, and I was willing to elevate her to that pinnacle. Secondly, deep in my heart, I despised both Vivian and Cashin. She had entered the palace as a mere commoner, possessing neither noble lineage nor an heir, yet Cashin bestowed upon her lofty titles and unprecedented courtly privileges. The courtiers petitioned fiercely against it in droves, and my father even dispatched a secret missive into my hands. It was the turn of the year, palace duties were exceedingly burdensome, and I was heavy with child. Yet, bound by my duty as queen, I had no choice but to seek Cashin out to reason with him. Outside the hall, a blizzard raged. He granted an audience to me alone, likely only out of consideration for the royal heir in my womb. The chamber was warm, but his expression was glacial as he looked down upon me, uttering 2 devastating sentences with terrifying casualness. "Even you come to force my hand. You do not understand. It is a rare thing for me to find someone worthy of entrusting my true heart to. I froze, clutching my sleeves in profound humiliation. A true heart. I had possessed one as well. When I wed Cashin, I had just passed my 16th name day. The moment my bridal veil was lifted, I met those quiet, bright eyes, and a profound ripple stirred within my soul. Thereafter, I served 3 years as crown princess, and another 3 as queen. We treated one another with courtesy and mutual respect, like a perfectly proper royal couple. I had foolishly believed that, at the very least, there was affection between us. I was so thoroughly heartbroken that I paid no heed to the remnants of snow clinging to my shoes. Taking my leave, I slipped upon the stone steps outside the grand doors and was consequently confined to my bed to preserve the pregnancy. That fall prompted Cashin to retract his decree for the very first time. Unable to contain her temper, Vivian burst into a tirade. "Ah, the crown princess," she sneered. I had heard tales of her virtue and originally wished to pay my respects, yet to think that to thwart my elevation, she would even use the babe in her womb. Such vicious schemes are truly despicable. She never should have struck at my deepest wound. Dragging my ailing body from my sickbed, I summoned her, ordered my attendants to strike her face several times, and had her banished from my chambers. Face red and swollen, she fled through the doors in floods of tears. Upon learning of this, Cashin flew into a towering rage. To vindicate her, he publicly bestowed those very titles and privileges upon her, ensuring I could never easily touch her again. Thus, the bitter enmity between Vivian and me was cemented. Yet I had no deliberate intention to torment her. She had spoken with insolence first, and had I failed to discipline her, I could never have commanded the respect of the court thereafter. I attempted to explain this to Cashin. After listening, he merely offered a casual smile, one tinged with undeniable mockery. If you merely wished to assert your authority, you needed only to publicly declare she had been punished, he said. Why actually strike her? My heart violently recoiled at his words. In that sudden, terrifying moment, I realized the truth. The man standing before me was not merely the crown prince. He could also serve as another woman's impenetrable shield. And he was entirely willing to subject me to profound humiliation for the sake of another. From then on, Vivian monopolized his favor, and all other ladies of the court retreated to give her a wide berth. I was utterly powerless. Overcome with heavy anxiety, I frequently thought of those queens who, having lost their monarch's grace, were ruthlessly deposed. History possessed no shortage of such tragic figures. Cashin was no puppet. He was the sovereign of this realm, holding the power of life and death upon a mere whim. I had disciplined Vivian, and he had issued his warning. I dared not imagine what my fate would be should I one day obstruct her path to power. A sickness took root in my heart, and I withered away with each passing day. During the 7th month of my pregnancy, Vivian offended me yet again. Cradling a hunting hound in her arms, she made an abrupt, cryptic remark. "Your Highness, the same trick can only be employed once." I furrowed my brow, ordered the guards to escort her away, and refused to grant her an audience. But it was too late. The hound suddenly went mad, barking fiercely as it lunged violently toward me. Though someone threw themselves in front of me to block the beast, the terror was absolute, and I collapsed heavily onto the ground. By the time Cashin rushed to the scene, Marguerite had already commanded the guards to apprehend Vivian. Vivian's face was streaming with tears, her delicate wrists bruised purple by the soldier's grip. Between sobs, she cried, "I know not what happened. The moment the queen saw me, she threw herself backward, and then ordered my beloved hound beaten to death." Cashin helped her to her feet, striding toward me with a countenance fraught with rage, convinced I was using my unborn child to frame her once more. But upon his arrival, he was met only with the horrific sight of maids carrying out basin after basin of bloody water. I had gone into premature labor. The infant survived a mere half-day, passing before a name could even be bestowed. I lay in a deep coma for 3 days. Cashin kept vigil by my side for 2 of them. Hovering on the precipice of death, I heard him whispering against my ear. "I was wrong. I misjudged her entirely," he murmured. "If only you wake, her fate shall be left entirely to your judgment, that by some cruel miracle, I survived the ordeal. Upon awakening, I dismissed all my attendants, gripped a short dagger, and went to find Vivian. The April air was no longer chilly. Yet I trembled so violently from the cold within that I could scarcely hold the hilt of the blade. The royal guards dared not impede the queen. Vivian was slumped on the floor, her jeweled hairpins askew, her face contorted in sheer terror. Just a few thrusts of the blade. I thought to myself, and she would pay with her life for my murdered child. But that dagger never met its mark. From a distance, an arrow tore through the air, violently piercing my wrist. The bow rested in Cashin's hands. Seeing him, Vivian scrambled to her feet and viciously kicked my knee. She threw herself into his embrace, weeping with the aggrieved terror of one who had barely escaped death. Cashin pushed her aside and gathered me into his arms. "Eleanor, I know your heart is shattered with agony, but her crimes do not warrant death," he stated. Every ounce of strength drained from my body. Like rootless duckweed, I drifted weightlessly against his chest. Tears broke like a shattered dam, surging torrentially down my cheeks. Vivian was placed under house arrest, forbidden to leave her chambers without a royal summons. It was Cashin's way of shielding her from my wrath. The poison I had meticulously prepared could find no way into her quarters. Knowing my time in this world was drawing to a close, I settled my final affairs. All that needed to be said had been spoken. For Cashin, I had but one final request: to crown Marguerite as the new queen. Upon hearing this, he agreed, using his fingertips to gently brush aside the damp hair clinging to my cheek. A flicker of bewilderment and sorrow passed swiftly through his eyes. He gazed at me in silence for a long time before speaking. "And what of me?" he asked. "Do you have not a single word left for me?" His voice carried an unexpected, hoarse tremor. What words could I possibly have left for him? He possessed the riches of the four seas, and his true love remained securely by his side. I wanted to tell him that I hated him, but I could not. I was dying, and the family I left behind would still have to serve him as their monarch. My pale lips curved into a faint smile as I softly uttered, "Then I wish your majesty a prosperous reign and everlasting peace." My hand was suddenly crushed in his grip. Cashin lowered his head, resting his forehead against mine, his movements trembling slightly. "Should there be a next life, I shall grant you the seat of princess once more," he swore. A searing drop of his tear fell upon my brow. My thoughts were already dissolving into shadows. In my fevered, fading consciousness, I mused. If there truly were a next life, I would never be his princess again. I breathed my last in his arms. He clutched my freezing hand, entirely unable to warm it. The rain that day had been exactly like the rain falling now, swaying through the air, dampening the cheeks. I wiped the moisture from my face and let out a very soft sigh. The Queen Mother's lady-in-waiting had been tasked with escorting me out of the palace, but after waiting a long time without her appearing, I turned around to look back. The grand doors of the hall were tightly shut, and beneath the eaves of the corridor stood a man, holding an unopened umbrella. Through the silk-like curtain of falling rain, his eyes locked with mine. It was Cashin. I remembered that before the official betrothal decree, the Queen Mother had already attempted to match us. During those days, I had chased after him, joining him in horseback riding and hunting, playing and making merry in the royal courtyards. His attitude toward me had always been utterly lukewarm. It was only after the betrothal was decreed that he finally offered me a smile, one that seemed part helpless resignation, part reluctant compromise. "Spending a lifetime with you, it seems it would not be so bad," he had said. I took an imperceptible step backward, lowered my eyes, and sank into a polite curtsy. "Greetings, Your Highness," I murmured. He descended the stone steps, one at a time. Through the mist, his features seemed dampened by the moisture, inexplicably tinged with a profound sense of loneliness. "Why was it not you?" he asked me. It was likely born of pure bewilderment. After all, compared to Marguerite, the Queen Mother clearly favored me, and I had previously shown every sign of harboring affection for him. I froze slightly. The surrounding attendants had all been dismissed, and receiving no answer from me, he lowered his head to gaze at me. The young Cashin had always been a man of few words, cold and distant to others. As if finding the words difficult to voice, He hesitated before asking once more. Why was it not you? The Queen Mother clearly chose you first. It was a difficult question to answer. I could hardly tell him how callously he had treated me in our past life, breaking my heart so thoroughly. Nor could I confess that my hatred remained completely unextinguished in this life, and that not only did I not wish to marry him, but I actually wanted him dead. I pressed my lips together. Because your highness does not bear any affection for me, I replied. To spend the rest of one's life facing a person one does not love would be far too tedious and painful. These were the very words he had once spoken. He had claimed Vivian was special, the true love of his heart. Thus, I had retreated step by step, and to maintain the fragile illusion of peace. I had even gone to persuade the Queen Mother myself. Nor did I force him to spend the latter half of his life trapped in mutual resentment with me. I died early. So early that before my mother's hair had even turned white, she had to come to the palace gates to escort my coffin. The royal chronicles praised my virtue and condemned Vivian with harsh reprimands. But when I thought about it, a virtuous reputation was utterly useless. Wealth and authority all vanished into smoke after death. All that remained was the agonizing heartbreak of those who loved me, and the gleeful applause of those who hated me. This time, I was going to live a good life. Cassian fell silent for a moment. His grip on the umbrella handle tightened, his knuckles turning a faint white. Then what if I were to say? Heavy, bead-like droplets of rain crashed down, striking the brim of the umbrella. Your Highness, I interrupted him softly. The rain is growing heavy. If I do not leave now, the roads will become treacherous to travel. The grand doors behind him opened, and the lady-in-waiting emerged at precisely the right moment, carrying an umbrella and hurrying forward with a smile. Your Highness, the Queen Mother and Lady Marguerite are both waiting for you inside, she announced. She then turned her gaze to me. Seeing that I already held a parasol, she offered me a handkerchief instead, urging me to wipe away the rain clinging to my garments. I thanked her and accepted it. Interrupted, Cassian left his sentence unfinished. His eyes lingered on me for a brief moment longer before he withdrew his gaze and stepped back into the grand hall. As the doors swung partially shut, the sound of the Queen Mother and Marguerite laughing and talking drifted out. They seemed to be mentioning Cassian. He let out a light chuckle and offered a few words in response. The lady-in-waiting guided me out of the palace grounds. The royal thoroughfare was immensely long. Only nobles of high rank were permitted the privilege of riding in carriages or palanquins within the walls. I walked for quite some time, my shoes and stockings becoming thoroughly splashed and dampened, leaving me looking somewhat unkempt. As the lady-in-waiting assisted me into my waiting carriage, she suddenly released a heavy sigh and remarked with profound meaning, "My lady is truly foolish. Prince Cassian was moved by you." This servant saw it with her own eyes. Was he truly moved? It was merely that he was unaccustomed to my sudden change in demeanor. Yet I knew the lady-in-waiting meant well. Everyone in the kingdom knew that the Queen Mother bore no biological children of her own, yet she heavily favored Cassian and Richard. The position of Crown Prince remained undecided, but Cassian was the elder, and his odds of succession were far greater. I lifted the carriage curtain with my fingertips and offered her a soft, gentle smile. My ambitions do not lie in that direction. I told her I returned to my family's estate earlier than expected. The household staff did not need to ask. They already understood what had transpired. How could I not have been chosen? My grandfather had once held the kingdom's highest office. My father was a deeply trusted minister to the king, and my lineage, talent, and beauty were entirely beyond reproach. How could Marguerite have bypassed me? My mother took my hand, speaking with great hesitation as she urged me not to be heartbroken. There are countless fine gentlemen in the realm. Marrying into the high nobility will be a good life too, she comforted me. I shook my head and told her that I had been the one to tactfully decline the match. I do not wish to marry a royal or a duke, I said softly. I only need a man of excellent moral character. And if there is no such man, remaining unwed is fine too. My mother was profoundly shocked. She never anticipated that an illustrious noble family like the Ashfords could have raised a daughter with a temperament like mine. She could not possibly know. I had been a queen. I had been immortalized in the royal chronicles, and yet, I had lived a truly miserable life. But I believed she would understand me. After my death in that past life, my mother had wept uncontrollably. Allying with the other noble ladies, she had vehemently demanded Vivian's punishment, while my father had stripped off his official robes and insignias, kneeling for days outside the palace gates, demanding an explanation from Cashin. And yet, I had clearly left them a letter, pleading with them to protect themselves and not to seek justice for my sake. Thinking of this, I lowered my head, a sudden tightness gripping my throat. Seeing my red, tear-filled eyes, she grew anxious. She patted the back of my hand, her tone softening completely. "All right," she agreed. A heavy burden lifted from my shoulders that I in the blink of an eye. 5 days passed. For reasons unknown, the palace delayed issuing the official betrothal decree for Cashin, and the ambitions of the various noble houses began to stir once more. The next time I saw Cashin was during the Mayflower Festival. It was a perfect spring day, a time when countless flowers bloomed in profusion, making it ideal for leisurely strolls. It was a brilliantly sunny day. The sunlight cascaded down, warm and comforting, allowing me to briefly forget the damp, biting cold of the royal chambers from my past. I sat by the edge of a flower bed alongside the ladies of the various noble houses, cutting colorful ribbons and tying them to the blooming branches. Marguerite proposed that we write something upon slips of parchment and hang them from the branches to make wishes to the goddess of flowers. Not far away, the young noblemen were gathered together, drinking wine, reciting poetry, and debating scholarly pursuits. One noble maiden kept stealing glances in that direction, her cheeks entirely flushed. Everyone knew her betrothed was among that group, so we teasingly urged her to go over and borrow a quill and ink. She returned with the writing implements, followed closely by an attendant. I recognized that attendant. He was the one who always trailed after Cashin. The attendant held a mahogany tray, his posture exceedingly respectful, a fawning smile plastered across his face. Resting on the tray was a finely bound stack of parchment, an elegant quill, and a bottle of ink. "This is a gift from His Highness to the second daughter of House Ashford," he announced. Such a distinct honor caused the entire group to turn their heads and stare. I, however, froze perfectly still. The tray felt as though it were scorching hot, and I was trapped between the impossibility of accepting it and the offense of refusing it. This had never happened in my past life. Faint giggles rippled through the surrounding ladies. "No wonder Prince Cashin has delayed his decision for so long. It turns out he is dissatisfied with Marguerite," someone whispered. Marguerite stood up, casting a glacial glare over the crowd. The immediate area fell dead silent. With a heavy, muffled sigh, she flicked her sleeves and walked away. I accepted the tray, set it down gently, and tossed out a single, sharp sentence. "Marguerite has earned the Queen Mother's favor and constantly attends Her Majesty. How could any of us possibly compare to her?" Marguerite walked with such speed that I had to jog to catch up with her. I did not know how to console her properly, so I merely babbled in her ear, insisting that she was already exceptional and had no need to listen to the gossip of others. In my past life, when dark depression knotted in my chest, it was she who tried to comfort me. Yet, everyone's ambitions lie in different places, making true empathy nearly impossible. She had been unable to ease my suffering then, just as I was failing to soothe her wounded pride now. We walked together for some distance before she let out a heavy breath and pulled me back toward the gathering. "Forget it," she declared. "If I hide away, it will only make it seem as though they struck a sore spot." I cut the colorful paper, and she penned a few lines, offering her prayers to the goddess of flowers. I wrote a wish as well. Borrowing her quill and ink'd, as the sun neared its zenith and the crowds began to disperse, Cashin walked toward us, approaching the vividly blossoming trees. Because of his tall stature, he spotted my ribbon at a single glance. Turning his head slightly, he read the words aloud in a hushed voice. "May the garden remain forever, devoid of wind and rain, where the spring birds sing of peace." He paused, abruptly stunned. "Is this truly your only wish?" he asked. I did not even look at him. "It is." That single wish alone was already extraordinarily difficult to achieve. In my unbearable past life, nothing had rained down upon me but miserable winds and bitter storms. Even right before my death, it was supposed to be a beautiful season, Yet I was terrified of the cold and the dampness. My unhealed wounds ached with agonizing ferocity, and every night, I lay there with red, open eyes, listening to the rain violently lash against the window panes as I meticulously planned my own funeral arrangements. I had clearly done absolutely nothing wrong. Yet I still ended up in such a wretched state. The exact same scene, the moment Cashin was added to it, mutated into a thoroughly dreadful memory. Cashin casually pinched another colorful ribbon hanging nearby, glancing over it briefly. "You ask for neither a good marriage, nor wealth, nor beauty." I offered no reply to his question. The wind swept through the treetops, causing the ribbons to sway in unison under the brilliant spring light. I brushed away a ribbon that had stuck to my forehead. His breathing grew faintly irregular. Realizing that I had no interest in engaging, he shifted his gaze away. The mahogany tray sat elsewhere. The gifts he had sent remained perfectly and neatly arranged, entirely untouched. Cashin's eyes darkened slightly. It seemed he finally understood that I was avoiding him as though he were the plague. I had far more pressing matters to attend to. After the Mayflower Festival passed, the investigation I had been quietly conducting for a long time finally yielded results. I had located the Vivian of my past life. Deep in the dead of night, inside an abandoned chapel on the outskirts of the city, I stood wearing a thick veil. I was gritting my teeth so fiercely that the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. My loyal maid, Nell, securely bound the unconscious young woman lying before us. "The parish registry and her given name have all been meticulously verified," Nell whispered. "This is exactly the person you are looking for, my lady." She never asked how I could possibly harbor such deep enmity toward a stranger I had seemingly never met, nor why I was so determined to see her dead. She only knew that my hatred ran so impossibly deep that if I did not see this deed finished, I would never find a moment's peace, day or night. A razor-sharp dagger was pressed into my hand. Staring down at that intimately familiar face, I forced myself not to think, not to hesitate, and with a single, brutal thrust, I buried the blade straight into her heart. Hot blood violently sprayed across my cheek, searing the skin. I slumped to the cold floor in a total daze, desperately pressing a handkerchief over my face. A shattered statue of the Holy Mother stood in solemn silence, seemingly absorbing the entire grim spectacle into her unblinking gaze. A chill wind blew through the night. Dead petals drifted through the air, sinking silently into the dirt. I thought of that child, the one who had entered this world for only the briefest, most fleeting glimpse. She had no name. Vivian had declared that her premature death was a curse of bad omens, and thus, my daughter was denied entry into the royal crypts, swept away with the passing spring like a trampled blossom. I had been trapped in a deep coma at the time. I had never seen her face, nor had I been given the chance to look upon her for the final time. I gripped the broken iron candelabra beside me so hard my fingernails felt as though they would sink into the metal. The agony in my heart was like a physical fist crushing the organ, choking off my breath, and my sobs were violently suppressed, breaking from my throat in ragged, stuttering gasps. Nell stood frozen in shock before gently patting my back a few times. I kept vigil from the dead of night straight through until the breaking dawn, to confirm with absolute certainty that the mortal enemy of my past life possessed no pulse, and that her body had gone thoroughly rigid. The first task, it was finally finished. While Nell stayed behind to dispose of the body and clean the scene, I stepped out of the chapel, utterly exhausted to the bone. The morning sunlight pierced through the thick fog, slanting warmly across the earth. And in that light, I saw it clearly. A lone figure was standing within the mist. The man possessed a lean, tall silhouette. His clothing was plain and entirely unremarkable, but I recognized him instantly, except, at this moment in time, he did not know who I was. And he had just caught me committing murder in my previous life. Cashin frequently spoke to me of a certain man, the scholar who took third place in that year's Royal Academic Examinations, Adrian Caldwell. Cashin deeply admired his brilliance and harbored clear intentions of bringing him into his own political fold. As the crown princess, accompanying Cashin, I had met the man once. Clad in the deep crimson robes of an official, his features were strikingly handsome and captivating, yet his aura was as chilling and unyielding as winter frost, commanding such a presence that one hardly dared to look him straight in the eye. When Cashin summoned him, he used his official duties as an excuse to coldly decline the invitation, a rejection that thoroughly displeased Cashin. The second time I saw him was during the severe floods at the kingdom's borders. He and Cashin had both traveled there to oversee the disaster relief efforts. Cashin had only gone to win the loyalty and admiration of the common people. I, however, pawned my own jewelry, changed into unadorned common garments, and stood by the muddy roadsides distributing bread and soup to the desperate refugees. It was the first clear day following heavy rains, and the sun beat down fiercely. Witnessing the profound suffering of the people, my heart felt suspended in a state of agonizing anxiety and completely unable to find rest. I forced myself to stand outside under the scorching sun for the entire day. That evening, seeing how utterly haggard I had become, Cashin held me tightly, his face full of tender concern, urging me not to take the charitable work so seriously. Yet for the next several days, I continued to go out. Adrian was there as well. No one could have ever anticipated that this high-ranking official dispatched from the royal capital, a man possessing the pure, aristocratic grace of someone born to sit securely upon a lofty pedestal, would be wading deep into the foulest mud, personally surveying the water levels and building embankments with his own hands, paying zero regard to the filth ruining the hems of his robes. I was filled with profound respect, and I stood there watching him for a very long time. It was as though my gaze physically burned him. His spine stiffened rigidly, and he did not dare turn his head to face me. Some time later, when Cashin attempted to recruit him once again, he discovered that Adrian had already aligned himself entirely with Prince Richard. Richard was known far and wide for his tolerant and benevolent nature. But he was also Cashin's most formidable political rival. The final time I saw him was after Richard's forces were crushed and Richard himself was executed. Cashin ascended the throne, and Adrian was consequently thrown into the royal dungeons as a prisoner of treason. I ventured down into the dark cells specifically to persuade him on Cashin's behalf. Cashin valued extraordinary talent. If Adrian proved willing to abandon his loyalty to his dead master and swear fealty to the new king, he would naturally be rewarded with high office and immense wealth, and their reconciliation would be praised throughout the realm as a legendary tale of a magnanimous sovereign and a wise minister. The dungeon was damp and freezing. I wore a thick, heavy cloak, while he was dressed in mere rags, huddled in the darkest corner. Unkempt hair obscured his eyes, and his skin was deathly pale, retaining absolutely nothing of his former, breathtaking elegance. He slowly raised his head, his expression as cold and composed as ice, looking entirely prepared to embrace his execution. As our eyes met, the words of persuasion caught in my throat, and in the end, I could not bring myself to say them. I merely ordered the guards to come in and scrub the filth from his cell, and to provide him with thick, warm clothing. I later pleaded with Cashin to spare his life and exile him to the furthest borders, arguing that refusing to execute a scholar of such unyielding integrity would brilliantly display the new monarch's supreme mercy. Cashin agreed to my counsel. After that solitary meeting in the darkness of the dungeon, up until the very day I died, Adrian and I never crossed paths again. The approaching figure walked slowly closer. Only then did I realize he was carrying a traveling pack, looking thoroughly weather-beaten from his journey. His eyelashes and the tips of his brows seemed to have caught the morning mist, making his eyes appear faintly damp as well. His facial contours were not like the sharp, austere lines I remembered from my past life, but were instead softened by the gentle greenness of youth. I knew that Adrian had been born into a desperately poor, common family. Yet I never expected that an abandoned chapel, a destitute young scholar, and a hurried journey to the royal examinations would align so perfectly with the tropes written in common folktales. In those stories, the noble lady would toss the impoverished scholar a handful of gold coins and then pledge herself to him in marriage. And what of me? Perhaps I would also toss him a sum of money, but solely for the purpose of buying his absolute silence, forbidding him from ever breathing a single word about what had transpired this day. My palms were slick with cold sweat. Securing my veil firmly, I reached out a single hand. Adrian spoke up, stating that he had already checked the perimeter and found no one nearby. He swore that he would never speak a word of this matter to another living soul. His voice was like a sudden gust of wind sweeping through a dense forest, shaking the dew from the leaves. I froze entirely, caught between profound shock and lingering suspicion. I did trust him, knowing that whatever words left his mouth would never be broken. But the absolute truth was that I had no other choice but to believe him. While Vivian had been easy to dispose of as a mere commoner, Adrian had already earned academic honors by this point, and I certainly could not murder him as well without provoking an even greater catastrophe. Therefore, I slowly withdrew my hand and softly murmured my thanks. The white fabric of my veil acted like a thick fog, preventing me from clearly reading his expression, though it seemed as if he offered a faint smile. And just like that, the gruesome affair dissipated like the spring breeze, leaving no one the wiser save for the three of us who had been present. As the spring days lengthened, the royal examinations approached rapidly. Constantly fretting over my unsettled marital prospects, my mother repeatedly joked that my father ought to take advantage of the examination results being posted to snatch up an excellent son-in-law for me. The Queen Mother was equally burning with anxiety. She had selected yet another fresh batch of highborn ladies. However, this time, Cashin suddenly presented a list of demands, finding fault with every single candidate and claiming each lacked some vital quality. Rumor had it that he had dreamt of a particular young woman. She hailed from an illustrious noble house, possessed a kind and profoundly gentle heart, spoke in soft, soothing tones, and unfailingly treated her servants with utmost courtesy. In his dream, they stood united through every triumph and tribulation, supporting one another in perfectly harmonious matrimony. Within that dream, a ceaseless spring rain fell while the shadows of trees swayed gently in the wind. Yet no matter how hard he tried, he could never clearly see her face, and upon waking, he was consumed by a profound sense of melancholic loss. There was certainly an abundance of gentle, virtuous daughters from noble houses. But who among them could truly guarantee that she would weather every storm by his side, never abandoning him for the rest of their natural lives? My mother gazed at me with deep worry, tenderly stroking the hair at my temples. She confessed her suspicion that, between the highborn lineage and the gentle, kind heart, Prince Cashin was still entirely fixated upon me. This was by no means a piece of good news. I merely shook my head, subtly tucking my blood-stained hands deeper into my sleeves. My hands were utterly freezing, and absolutely nothing could warm them. I asked her how I could possibly be considered kind-hearted. I had just murdered someone with my own hands, and in the days to come, I would certainly kill yet another. On the day the royal examination results were publicly unveiled, I stood on an upper balcony, arm in arm with Marguerite, watching the top-ranking scholar parade through the streets on horseback. She had practically begged me to accompany her, insisting it would at least be a pleasant feast for the eyes. She mentioned hearing that this year's top scholar possessed a countenance that thoroughly eclipsed even the man who took third place. My mind drifted briefly. Before ascending to the position of crown princess in my past life, I had paid absolutely no attention to political affairs. With so many years having passed, unless they were directly entangled with my fate, I could not even recall the names of the top 3 scholars. A gentle spring breeze brushed against my face, sending a flurry of flower petals cascading downward. I was using my fingers to comb through the loose hair at my temples, but as I cast my gaze down into the street, I instantly froze in stunned disbelief. Adrian was riding a pristine white horse, a branch of laurel pinned proudly to his hat, basking in an unparalleled moment of glory, yet his expression remained as composed and completely devoid of arrogance as ever. Flower petals rained down, entirely covering his shoulders. The very blossom that had just brushed against my temple spiraled downward in rhythm with my movement, and he abruptly tipped his head up, catching the falling petal perfectly in the palm of his hand. As if guided by some unseen intuition, our eyes locked together. It felt as though an eternity had bridged the gap between us, leaving me entirely lost to the flow of time. It was not until Nell rushed upstairs to call for me, stating that my father urgently wished to see me, that I hastily gathered my skirts and hurried down the steps. This year, my father had been placed in direct charge of overseeing the examination proceedings. Though he enjoyed the advantage of proximity, he still had to fiercely argue for a considerable time, nearly coming to physical blows with the other ranking ministers, just to successfully intercept that terribly earnest, fiercely introverted top scholar before anyone else could. My father proudly claimed credit for the accomplishment. He explained that this top scholar was poor with words and terrified to speak with me, but under his forceful encouragement, the young man was coming to personally ask for my hand in marriage. I was completely stunned. That he was poor with words was undoubtedly true. It seemed the only time his words flowed like brilliant pearls was when he was drafting royal petitions. But was he truly terrified to speak with me? Casting my memories back, I recalled everyone constantly remarking that Lord Caldwell possessed a face that made it impossible to look away, coupled with a fiercely unyielding and upright temperament. Yet he alone lacked the courage to look at me, frantically dodging my gaze every single time as though he had stumbled upon a horrifying monster. The royal celebratory banquet had not yet commenced. Adrian had already dismounted and stood off to the side, his posture rigidly straight, his entire demeanor radiating a bright, dignified clarity. Yet his fingertips seemed to be shaking violently, causing the flower stem in his grip to tremble uncontrollably. He lowered his thin eyelids, his earlobes flushing as brightly red as the laurel branch itself, and his words tumbled out wrapped in deep, agonizing apprehension. He confessed that all he possessed in this world was a single, entirely sincere heart and his own life, and that he was offering both up to Lady Ashford, begging her to accept them. I could not even begin to fathom the sheer magnitude of courage it had taken him to utter those words. I knew unequivocally that he was a man of exceptionally fine moral character. I had personally witnessed him petitioning for the desperate, starving commoners. I had seen him boldly defy the monarch's wrath to speak the harsh truth. It seemed that every single facet of his soul was fundamentally good. I gently rubbed the fabric of my skirt between my fingers, knowing that avoiding marriage altogether was highly improbable. If the husband had to be him, it truly seemed like a wonderful outcome. Lifting my gaze to meet his, I offered a bright, genuine smile and softly agreed. My father burst into booming laughter, shoving playfully at the fellow ministers gathered around him. He loudly announced that the crowd should disperse, proudly declaring that the top scholar was officially becoming the son-in-law of House Ashford, and there was no longer any need to wait around. The sharp clatter of approaching hooves shattered the moment. In an instant, the festive atmosphere surrounding us plunged into a terrifying, icy silence. The entire crowd turned as one, bowing deeply to pay their respects to Prince Cassian. I followed suit, dipping into a flawless curtsy. Yet I saw him swing down from his saddle and march in a dead straight line toward me, his shadow falling heavily across the ground to swallow me whole, pressing down with the suffocating weight of thunderclouds. His voice was laced with pure ice as he demanded to know what exactly Eleanor Ashford had just promised the scholar. Cassian was merely scheduled to attend the banquet as a royal companion that day. Yet here he stood, physically blocking the path of every soul present, his face twisted with dark fury, looking entirely like a catastrophic storm preparing to break. I felt absolutely no fear toward him. All the highest ministers of the realm were present. The king himself was arriving shortly, and under the watchful gaze of the entire public. What outrageous act could he possibly commit? I raised my head and replied with perfect, unassailable decorum, stating that I had just accepted the top scholar's proposal of marriage. It was an entirely ordinary sentence, yet it struck his eyes like a heavy stone violently hurled into a placid lake, stirring up endless, chaotic ripples of panic. He looked exactly as though he had been struck by lightning, his entire body locking into rigid paralysis. Frantic desperation and profound bewilderment twisted violently together within his gaze. Adrian fixed his eyes firmly upon the prince, his brow hardening as though thick frost had settled over it. I calmly lowered my head. The banquet was on the verge of commencing, and since I possessed no invitation to enter the hall, I offered my formal farewells to the gathered lords and departed the grounds ahead of them. The royal celebratory banquet was a roaring, boisterous affair. According to my father's later recount, the king had been in exceptionally high spirits, and right there in the middle of the feast, he had publicly bestowed his royal blessing upon the marital union between Adrian and myself. Cassian remained entirely absent-minded throughout the proceedings, and for reasons entirely unknown to the court, he lost his grip and violently shattered a silver wine goblet upon the floor. The matter of my marriage to Adrian was thus definitively settled into dust. He continuously sent an abundance of gifts to the estate, Occasionally they were precious artifacts rewarded directly by the king, while other times they were rare books or paintings he had bartered for with others. Without even needing to formally enter the Royal Academy, he had been directly appointed to an official government post by the king, securing a steady and respectable salary. His betrothal gifts piled higher and higher with each passing day. Staring at the ever-growing registry of items, I frequently found myself taken by genuine surprise. Throughout my entire previous life, he had remained utterly and completely alone. Cassian had even jokingly mocked him to me once, speculating aloud about what a man as rigidly uncompromising as Adrian could possibly be like if he ever took a wife. Cassian had claimed the scholar's heart held room for absolutely nothing but state affairs, and that whoever became his bride would be doomed to suffer a profoundly lonely and isolated existence. But I finally knew the truth now. He possessed no vast fortune or ancestral wealth, but he would empty every last coin to his name just to offer up a single, completely devoted heart. Whenever he managed to secure a brief reprieve from his official duties, Adrian and I would venture out together to enjoy the scenery. We passed beneath ancient stone arch bridges, watching fallen blossoms drift aimlessly across the flowing water. He grasped the wooden oars firmly, rowing the small wooden boat himself. Gazing down at him, I realized for the very first time that the hands which wielded the scholar's quill were surprisingly broad, with sharply defined knuckles. It was no wonder that in our past life, he had been perfectly capable of hauling heavy bricks and drawing a war bow. My intense, unblinking stare caused Adrian to grow visibly uncomfortable, and his rhythm faltered, sending the little boat veering crookedly toward the grassy riverbank. I leaned forward slightly over the edge of the boat. A breeze caught the edge of my veil, dragging the sheer white fabric softly across the side of his face. His eyelashes fluttered wildly before he abruptly snapped his head away, raising a hand to awkwardly fix the veil back into place. His face and ears burned a violent shade of red, and he absolutely refused to look back at me. He softly called out my first name, Eleanor. It was the very first time I had ever heard him address me so intimately. In our previous life, by the time he arrived in the royal capital, I was already securely cemented as the future crown princess. Following that, I ascended to become the queen. When the royal guards delivered the news down into the blackness of the dungeon, informing him that the queen had officially pardoned his life, a faint spark of life had returned to his hopelessly dim eyes, and he had bowed deeply in gratitude. Yet he had never once dared to utter my name. He confessed that, in absolute truth, he had been standing completely outside the chapel that entire night. He had already amassed significant scholarly fame in his home province, and wealthy patrons had provided him with ample travel funds long in advance. He had absolutely no need to seek shelter in a ruined church, but had merely been passing by on his journey when he accidentally stumbled upon me committing murder. Adrian was a man defined entirely by his unyielding righteousness. Yet on that specific night, his sole reaction had been to stand guard in the freezing dark, fully concealing my horrific crime from the world. While the wind howled and wept outside the stone walls, I sobbed violently within, and he stood outside releasing heavy, sorrowful sighs. He asked me quietly if the debts from the past were still not yet fully repaid. A fresh wave of grievance washed over me, and gripping the edge of my veil tightly, I offered a muffled confirmation. There was absolutely no need to speak the words aloud. He had also been reborn from that terrible past life. He explained that he had initially lacked the courage to ask for my hand, knowing perfectly well that his low station made him unworthy of me. Yet having witnessed my miserable fate in our past life, he realized that even the most exalted sovereign in all the realm was entirely incapable of bringing me happiness, and thus, that monarch was the one truly unworthy of me. Given a second chance at life, he had fought with everything he had to claim the highest honor in the examinations, and only after earning my father's genuine admiration did he finally dare to voice his desperate hope. He lowered his head, his dark reflection wavering across the shimmering, sunlit surface of the lake. He begged for Eleanor to bestow her favor upon him. The small boat drifted aimlessly for another half-hour before finally bumping gently against the dock. I placed my hand firmly into Adrian's awaiting palm. Lifting the hem of my skirt, I stepped off the wooden boat, only to walk directly into Prince Cassian's fully assembled royal retinue. He had been standing there waiting the entire time, his eyes locked onto our tightly joined hands, his face twisted into an expression of murderous gloom. Cashin declared that every single memory had violently returned to him. He remembered with agonizing clarity how I had stood fiercely by his side, not merely helping him build his royal prestige piece by painstaking piece, but even on the terrifying day of the violent palace coup, I had remained firmly anchored to him, sharing both the threat of death and the promise of survival. He stepped closer, forcing us backward with every stride. He demanded to know why Eleanor was now standing safely by another man's side. His hair had not been properly styled that morning, and having clearly ridden at a desperate, breakneck pace to reach us, it was wildly disheveled, making his entire demeanor appear disturbingly sinister and entirely stripped of his usual aristocratic elegance. He turned his wrath upon Adrian, snarling that had he known the scholar harbored such treasonous desires, he would have utterly ignored Eleanor's merciful pleas and had him violently hacked into 1,000 bloody pieces. He bit down on those final words with terrifying force, radiating an absolute, consuming hatred. Adrian displayed not a single trace of fear, meeting the prince's furious glare with glacial calm. The wind sweeping off the lake caused the ribbon tying his hair back to snap sharply in the air, mimicking the deadly flash of a drawn sword. He addressed His Highness directly, reminding the prince that the current days were entirely unlike the past, and with the ultimate victors still undecided, no man could yet predict whose hands would claim the crown. Given this second chance at life, Cashin was not yet the anointed king, and the final outcome remained dangerously unwritten. Should Prince Richard seize the throne, the man destined to be hacked to pieces would be Cashin himself. Cashin's eyes burned red as he stared at me, all color rapidly draining from his skin until he was deathly pale. He asked if I genuinely believed that as well, if I truly believed he was destined to lose the war for the crown. The frightened civilians strolling around the lake had already been violently dispersed by the guards, absolutely terrified to cast even a single glance in our direction. He directed his desperate question entirely at me. He demanded to know if serving as his wife had brought me no joy. Adrian's expression plunged into absolute frost as he stepped forward to shield me entirely behind his body. He was exceptionally tall as well, and his commanding presence yielded not a single inch to the furious prince. He bluntly stated that His Highness was deeply confused if he truly believed such a painfully obvious question still required an answer. By the time my life violently extinguished, I had served as Cashin's lawful wife for 7 grueling years, meticulously fulfilling every single royal duty without ever once displaying anger toward him. He had arrogantly convinced himself that he treated me well. He reasoned that I held supreme authority over the entire palace, and that, even when a favored concubine trampled recklessly over my dignity, he never allowed her to actually threaten my unshakable position as queen. As I lay dying, I had wished him a prosperous reign and an eternity of unbroken peace. And he, in turn, had promised to claim me in the next life. He delusionally believed this was a profoundly heavy vow, absolutely convinced that the moment our paths crossed again, our fates would violently intertwine, and I would inevitably become his predestined queen. Yet he had stared directly at my agonizing suffering and chosen to willfully, callously ignore every bit of it. I looked straight into his eyes and told him that those dying words were nothing more than empty, placating lies meant to manage him. As flower petals drifted silently to the ground behind his back, the very sky above us seemed to darken with gloom as I explicitly stated that I hated him, Cashin, and that my sole wish for this lifetime was to never lay eyes upon him again. My only desperate desire in those final moments had been to ensure the survival of the innocent family I was leaving behind. There had not been a single drop of genuine truth in any word I spoke to him. The arrogant expression plastered across Cashin's face shattered into 1,000 pieces, cracking apart inch by excruciating inch. His skin turned the sickening color of dead ash as he staggered backward in sheer, uncomprehending disbelief, his large frame swaying violently as he nearly collapsed to the cobblestones multiple times. Ignoring him entirely, I tipped my head back to look up at Adrian, my eyes overflowing with a bright, radiant smile. I cheerfully asked my betrothed where we should venture to next, and then reminded him that we were supposedly bound for the grand church to sit down with the priest and finalize the exact date of our wedding. Adrian and I sat with the head priest, meticulously calculating the stars to select the most auspicious day possible for our wedding ceremony. Cashin was rendered utterly powerless to intervene. Only now did he finally understand the suffocating helplessness I had endured in our past life. Though I had appeared to wield limitless authority and bathed in public glory, the terrifying reality was that a sovereign ruled directly above me, and without his explicit permission, absolutely nothing could be achieved. In a desperate bid to change his fate, Cashin fell to his knees on the hard stone outside the king's audience chamber and refused to rise. A heavy, leather-bound ledger was violently hurled through the doors, smashing brutally against the corner of the prince's forehead. The king roared furiously, condemning the sheer absurdity of a royal prince attempting to forcibly steal the lawfully wedded bride of his own loyal minister. He commanded Cashin to never breathe another word of the matter, swearing that if the prince ever dared repeat such a disgraceful act, he would be banished back to his miserable fiefdom and permanently barred from re-entering the capital city without a royal summons. These were devastatingly heavy words for a reigning monarch to hurl at a son. It was a stark, undeniable warning that Cashin was entirely severing his own path to the throne. On the day I was finally married, Cashin did not make an appearance at the extravagant banquet. The king had explicitly forbidden Adrian from even sending the disgraced prince an invitation. Instead, Cashin locked himself inside the largest, loudest tavern in the capital city and drank himself into a state of senseless, catastrophic oblivion. Once the drunken stupor finally wore off, cold clarity returned to him. Indeed, no matter how the world violently shifted around him, the only thing that ultimately mattered to Cashin was always his own survival and ambition. He was drowning in miserable failure. But for me, it was the brilliantly lit, joyous night of my wedding consummation. In the past life, Cashin had presented a mask of gentle courtesy to the outside world, yet reserved his cruelest, most suffocating indifference exclusively for the wife who failed to perfectly align with his desires. Adrian, conversely, maintained a terrifyingly stern and joyless facade around others, but the absolute moment his eyes found mine, the fearsome aura of the unyielding minister vanished entirely, leaving him blushing furiously after only a few words, constantly terrified that I would find him dreadfully dull. I had consumed several cups of sweet wine, and looping my arms loosely around his neck, I drunkenly mumbled a question, asking exactly when he had first fallen in love with me. Adrian answered immediately, swearing it was the very first moment his eyes ever saw me. Under the dim, wavering glow of the candles, the rigid boundary separating our past nightmare from this present joy blurred completely out of existence. I giggled with a touch of arrogant pride, teasingly telling Lord Caldwell that he possessed terrifyingly immense audacity. His Adam's apple bobbed heavily in his throat, fully aware that his desires back then could only be classified as treasonous covetousness. Moving with incredible gentleness, he pinned my wrists down, leaning his large frame close as his eyes blazed as brightly as falling stars. He whispered that he was capable of being far more audacious still. Then he huskily asked for my permission. Once his drunken stupor ended, Cashin violently threw himself back into the treacherous currents of court politics. Relying heavily upon his stolen memories of our past life, he was supposed to easily achieve massive, glorious triumphs. But historical events had been meticulously, rigidly designed, and the slightest microscopic deviation was enough to ruin the entire structure. Our mutual rebirth had unconsciously, but irreparably shattered the original trajectory of fate. The catastrophic disasters of the past life entirely failed to manifest on schedule. The root cause of the border floods fundamentally shifted, and the sheer volume of starving refugees changed drastically. Cashin rode out overflowing with arrogant confidence, only to be brutally blindsided by reality, entirely failing to play the role of the kingdom's divine savior. Prince Richard, however, achieved total success. He possessed a genuinely tolerant heart and placed the survival of the common people above all else. Adrian and I traveled extensively across the afflicted provinces together. Just as before, I stood by the muddy roadsides distributing hot bread and soup and volunteering inside the overwhelmed medical tents. Meanwhile, he simply rolled up his fine sleeves and waded straight into the muck to perform the agonizing, back-breaking labor that absolutely no one else was willing to touch. I vividly remembered the very first time I had witnessed him do this in our past life. I had refused to believe that a scholar renowned across the kingdom for his breathtaking beauty could not only be so absurdly serious, but also perfectly willing to degrade himself with such filthy work. Yet this time around, it was both of us standing shoulder to shoulder in the foul, murky floodwaters, caring absolutely nothing about the ruin of our expensive garments. The desperate commoners lining the roads loudly praised both our names together, making it seem as though Eleanor and Adrian had been forged by the gods specifically to stand as one. I zoned out for a brief second, before slowly coming to a profound realization. This was exactly what I had desperately wanted all along: to advance and retreat entirely as equals. Adrian earned a rapid promotion, once again donning the heavy, deep crimson robes of a high-ranking minister. He served as Prince Richard's most deeply trusted confidant, and proved even more terrifyingly calm and brilliant than he had been in our past life, handling every complex crisis flawlessly. The royal palace, however, had recently plunged into deep instability. The king had fallen gravely ill. The illness struck much earlier than it had in my memories. Yet precisely as it had happened before, the monarch died violently and abruptly, passing away without leaving behind a single letter of succession or formal royal decree. Richard had been meticulously preparing for this moment, but so had Cashin, and the two rival factions instantly ignited a bloody palace coup. After half a day of brutal, close-quarters slaughter, Cashin managed to flee the castle grounds. Though his military forces were vastly inferior, he had actually ruled as king in his past life, granting him intimate knowledge of the palace's intricate layout and the secret escape routes known exclusively to the sovereign. Richard was gripped by severe anxiety, terrified that failing to pull the enemy up by the roots would allow the rogue prince to amass an army and return to wage a devastating civil war. I stepped forward and calmly stated that I knew exactly where Cashin would run. Richard shot me a look of profound astonishment before turning his gaze toward Adrian. Adrian's expression did not change by even a fraction of an inch. He merely stated that he would personally lead a squad of men to protect me on the hunt. I successfully tracked Cashin down. I had not seen him in a very long time, and the relentless anxiety and plotting had left his face gaunt and haggard. His silver armor was heavily smeared with blood, making it appear as though he had finally reached the absolute end of his rope, and though his personal guards lay dead around him, there were still loyalists waiting to extract him beyond the palace walls, meaning that if he survived this night, he still possessed a chance to reclaim the throne. I softened my eyes to a gentle expression, quietly promising Cashin that I could guide him to safety. It was such a beautifully simple sentence. The moonlight poured down perfectly, illuminating the tips of my hair and the hem of my gown, making me look exactly as I had during the years I stood faithfully by his side. I whispered that I simply could not bear to see him die. He lifted his wretched, exhausted face to look at me, the faint gleam of tears shining in his eyes. He was struck by a mix of euphoric surprise and deep emotional shock, appearing genuinely moved to his core. This was exactly how he had callously dangled hope in front of me in our past life, swearing that Vivian's ultimate fate rested entirely in my hands. Yet immediately following that promise, he had driven a heavy arrow straight through my wrist, violently severing my final, desperate chance at revenge. Staring at him now, I felt an intense urge to burst into tears and simultaneously scream with laughter, but through his delusional eyes, he perceived my turmoil as proof that I still fiercely loved him and was agonizing over his safety. After all, we had shared a marital bed for 7 years. And after all, he remained arrogantly confident in his own ability to command my absolute devotion. Cashin scrambled to his feet, agreeing to follow my lead. He swore that if he managed to slaughter his way back to the throne, I would be the only woman he ever desired to rule beside him in the royal palace. Forcing down the violent urge to mock him outright, I simply lifted my skirts and led him fleeing down a completely deserted, hidden pathway. However, my physical stamina could not match a soldier's, and I gradually fell behind him in the dark. Gripping the cold dagger concealed within my sleeve, I gasped for breath, crying out that I could not run a single step further. He immediately spun around to pull me forward, only to suddenly find a razor-sharp blade buried straight through his chest. I violently wrenched the dagger free, my face entirely devoid of emotion, and plunged it deeply into him a second time. His eyes bulged in horrific, uncomprehending shock. A low, wet gasp tearing its way out of his throat. I offered him a calm, pleasant smile, asking him if he could finally feel the agonizing sting of absolute betrayal. He was completely stripped of any capacity to fight back, yet still clung weakly to life, which provided me with the rare, leisurely opportunity to hold a proper conversation with him. I informed him that Vivian, the woman he had loved above all else in his past life, was already rotting in the dirt. I had personally murdered her a very long time ago. I told him my only regret was that his death had been delayed for so long, preventing him from properly reuniting with her in hell. He expended the last dregs of his strength to reach out a trembling hand, desperately attempting to seize the hem of my dress. His breathing was sickeningly weak, his voice slurred and so faint it was nearly impossible to hear. He rasped my name, and gasped out that after I died, he had personally ordered her execution, forcing her to pay for my life with her own. Since I had not survived long enough to witness the aftermath, I had absolutely no way of knowing whether those words were truth or a final, desperate lie. Nor did I possess any means of determining whether Vivian had truly been the grand love of his life, or merely an entertaining pet he had favored for a fleeting moment in time. The only thing I remembered with absolute certainty was that I had treated him exceptionally well, pouring every ounce of my soul into his service. And he had treated me appallingly, acting exactly like a sworn enemy determined to destroy me. I coldly withdrew my gaze from his dying face and plunged the dagger into him a final time. In perfect synchronization, the royal assassins who had been lurking in the shadows all stood up from their hiding places. I was an exceptionally cautious woman and had never planned to lure him out alone. Even if he had detected my murderous intentions earlier, it would not have saved him. The only difference would have been dying by my blade instead of being instantly shredded by a volley of arrows. Gripping the bloody dagger tightly, I announced with crystal clarity to the shadows that the traitorous rebel had been permanently eliminated. Adrian strode rapidly out of the darkness, gathering me violently into a crushing embrace. He gently wiped the cold sweat from my forehead, firmly supporting my violently shaking body against his own. Bending down slightly, he pressed his forehead flush against mine and let out a long, heavy sigh. He whispered my name. He offered absolutely no other words, merely repeating my name over and over again with devastating tenderness and profound, aching pity. From a woman who had once been genuinely gentle and kind-hearted, down to the bloody murderer I was today, I had simply endured far too much suffering for one lifetime. This was to be the first true spring I had witnessed since my rebirth. The new king officially ascended the throne, issuing a grand decree of universal amnesty and significantly slashing taxes across the realm. The gentle spring rains nourished the earth, and a ruined kingdom began the painstaking work of total renewal. For my undeniable merits in assisting the new monarch to power, I was officially granted the title of Countess. Recognizing that my heart and mind were entirely exhausted, the new king mercifully granted Adrian a full month of leave, ordering him to escort me on a journey to heal my battered soul. Our pleasure boat drifted slowly down the long river, and naturally, we encountered rain along the journey. Wrapped merely in a woven straw cloak, I stood freely at the bow of the ship, allowing the cold droplets to pool directly into the palms of my hands. Adrian constantly monitored my face, terrified that the dreary weather would trigger agonizing memories of the past. I offered him a completely free and unburdened smile, assuring him that such pain would never return. It was nothing more than watching the wind and rain sweep across the great river, and calmly witnessing the endless rise and fall of the tide.